Good evening. You're watching the India Development Debate. I'm Tamanna Inamdar. Now, if you've been seeing the Chief Economic Advisor, KV Subramanian's quote all day, telling the private sector to not say, Papa mujhe bacha lo, and wondering what it's all about, you've tuned into the right show. So first, Chief Economic Advisor, Mr. Subramanian, spoke exclusively to ET Now in a wide-ranging conversation on several issues, and also touched upon the current state of the economy. When asked about a possible, kind of help for the private sector, which is currently reeling under the impact of the slowdown, here's what the Chief Economic Advisor had to say.
I would say that the private sector in India now, since 1991, we basically are almost now 30 years. So we have a 30-year-old kid. And yes, among that, there are basically younger kids, no doubt. But a 30-year-old, man, adult, needs to, now start saying, okay, I can stand on my own feet. I don't need to keep going to Papa. Papa mujhe ye de do, Papa mujhe wo de do. That is something which is, really important to, but let me be, I'm not for even a moment, dismissing what you're saying on, I think financial inclusion is very, very critical, is important. But this message of basically private sector cannot have a situation of private profits and socialized losses. I think that needs to basically move on. We need to move on. We are a market economy. In a market economy, assets do get reallocated when somebody doesn't, let's say manage the asset very well. Reallocation needs to happen. There are sectors that basically go through sunrise and then have a sunset. And sunset sectors, basically, there are, reallocation happens. These are important aspects. So the private sector also needs to recognize that, the mindset needs to change from basically as whenever you actually are, let's say, having a difficulty, keep going, keep crying, basically running to Papa, to basically, saying, Papa, bacha do mujhe.
All right. The message to the private sector comes at a time when various sectors, from autos to NBFCs to real estate, are hoping for a bailout of some sort from the government. So what's the message here in terms of how the government is viewing the slowdown and what its responses could be? It's an important day because ET Now has spoken exclusively to Union Minister Nitin Gadkari today as well, who has talked about a package for the auto sector. So what's the message here? Speaking to us on this now are Sumant Sinha from Renew Power Ventures Limited. I'm also joined by Sudipto Mundle from NIP-FP, Madan Sabnavis, Chief Economist at Care Ratings, and our very own Maithili Bosnurmat, Consulting Editor, ET Now. Welcome to all of you and thank you for speaking with us today. I'm going to start with Madan Sabnavis and get an economist's view of what essentially an economist has said, the Chief Economic Advisor, of course. And he's reiterated those comments in a sense in a tweet he put out earlier this evening as well. The message, does it seem to be that, yes, the private sector is having trouble, but don't expect big fat bailouts from the government. So don't come crying to your daddy at this point.
No, I think what the Chief Economic Advisor has said is definitely a point of view. But I would tend to have a different view because if you look at what happens in various countries, I think it's generally run by the private sector. And whenever you do have serious problems, you do go back to the government. And I think one of the responsibilities of the government is to provide an enabling environment. So today, when we're talking of a bailout, so-called bailout from the government, it's not necessarily saying that the government will have to put in funds in order to revive the private sector. It's a case of certain kind of policy responses. Like, for example, if we're talking of the auto sector, we all know that this drive towards electric vehicles, high registration charges, insurance charges, the timing of these kind of reforms could have been probably different. So I think when the sector goes and appeals to the government to be a bit more flexible when it comes to policies, I think it's perfectly all right, and that's how all economies move. It's not just because you're in the market economy that you can say that companies should close down if they're not able to function. It's not the duty of the government to use social resources for private sake. I think this happens everywhere because the private sector is not just working for itself. It is producing certain goods and services for the wider good. So I think that's how the market economy works, where everybody works for private interest. Yeah. And entire society actually gains from it. So I don't see anything wrong out here. It happens in all countries. I think we're talking of Donald Trump, you're talking of the European economies, Japan. Everywhere it is a case of saying that the government provides the right kind of support, especially when the conditions are not that good. And we should remember that two policies of the government, demonetization and GST, have been major setbacks for whatever reasons for the private sector. So I think asking for some help, I don't see anything wrong in it.
Well, asking for some help, but which sectors need help? Here Mr. Subramanian, and I'm coming to you, Maithili, makes the point about sunset sectors and sunrise sectors. He gives the example of, young child and a child in his 30s and says that the young ones need to be helped. He actually touched upon those themes in the economic survey as well, if you understand. The idea is, does it give us some kind of an inkling to how the government is thinking right now, as we're all waiting to see what response comes in from the government?
Well, literally, Tamanna, the first way to actually tackle any problem is to first recognize the problem. If we find that somebody like the CA seems to be in denial of the problem, I don't see how we're ever going to get out of it. And I entirely second Madan when he says it's not as if the private sector is asking for funds. They're not asking for a bailout. All they're asking is for an enabling environment. Just take a very simple example of enforcement of contracts. The very famous economist Milton Friedman had said that there's just three things that the government needs to do: defense, law and order, and enforcement of contracts. And when we come to India's record in enforcement of contracts, India's rank is 163 or 190 as per the latest ease of doing business. Sure, overall we moved up tremendously. Now we're now 77, but ease of doing contracts, enforcement of contracts is a very basic tenet of doing business in any country. And if you cannot enforce contracts for whatever reason, because of judicial delays, etc., there's just no way you can possibly do business. So there are certain sectors who are specifically hurting, because as Madan said, in the case of auto, in the case of telecom, in the case of power, they're very specific issues. So government does need to look at this. So government should be important to realize that they should play a role as an enabler. Today in many areas, government is playing an obstructionist role. So I think it's a little unfair and both uncharitable of the CA to talk of the private sector like this, and I'm not holding a brief for the private sector here, but I do think it's important that government recognizes that it needs to play a role, that of enabler.
Okay, I want to come to the representative of the private sector on this panel per se, Mr. Sumant Sinha. How do you look at this situation? Because we're currently in a situation where I think perhaps never before to this extent has the private sector and leaders of industry spoken out. And even now, they're holding back because what they say off record is sometimes different from what they say on record. But clearly, there is pain in the system. What would you hope to hear from the government at this point, and how do you read the comments made by the chief economic advisor in that exclusive interview to ET Now?
Thank you, Tamanna. Look, I think that the fact that we're in a slowdown, which is quite significant, is something that everybody has acknowledged, everybody has talked about. Certainly people in the private sector have spoken up about it. The government has also acknowledged it. I think that we've seen a number of stories that have come out about the FM talking to people in industry. I think as a recognition of the fact that something needs to be done. I think there have also been articles about the fact that some sort of a program might be in the works on behalf of the government or on the part of the government. And so I think there is a recognition that there is an issue right now. We are in some sort of a slowdown. The debate has been whether this slowdown is cyclical or whether this is structural, and partly that is because depending on the nature of slowdown, maybe certain steps or certain other steps might be required, and so therefore it's important to understand what has got us to this point, to diagnose and then figure out what is required to be done to get us out of this situation. So I think there is widespread acknowledgement both across the public, across the private sector, as well as from the government as regards this issue. And I think we're really waiting for the government to come back after the FM had spoken to various industry groups. She had very candid conversations, very positive conversations. She did say that they were going to be looking at coming out with certain ideas and programs to address the problem that we're in. So we're very hopeful that something therefore positive will emerge from all of that. Now, as regards the Chief Economic Advisor's comments, I think his comments are, first of all, let me say that we're all one team, right? It's not as if any particular one sector is looking for a bailout and therefore, whether that should be given to them or not given to them. I think if a large part of the Indian economy starts doing poorly, then it will have knock-on effects on the rest of the economy as well. And so therefore, it behooves the policymakers to try to address pockets of slowdown as they emerge so that they don't become more widespread and sort of drag the whole economy down with it. So I think we really have to look at it from that standpoint. So I think from that point of view, to then say that, look, companies will come and companies will go, I think all of that is perfectly valid in a very free market and very open kind of a capitalist system where regulatory touch is very light, where we have all the freedom in the world to make the right kinds of decisions. But that is not the case in India right now. We are not operating in that kind of economy. We, as I think, as Maithili said, we are in an economy where the government does play a very significant role, and therefore the actions that it takes, the steps that it takes, does have a fairly significant bearing on the private sector as well. And so therefore, it is important for those policies to be properly in place, to be correctly in place, so that they actually are encouraging and enabling rather than negative, and thereby drag sectors down. So I think that's the spirit with which we should look at how to address this issue on a mutual basis. I know the government has fairly significant fiscal concerns right now, and there's very limited room to maneuver, and so therefore that is definitely weighing on their minds as well. And within that, they'll have to find, and they'll have to make trade-off decisions as to whether they want to let this carry on for some more time or whether they can find some fiscal room and thereby figure out what is the right way to spend that fiscal room and to get the economy out of the position that we're in right now.
Okay, but the message seems to be going beyond fiscal constraints, and just in case our viewers are thinking that we're picking off on one comment and making too much about it, I want to just read out a quote, a tweet actually that the Chief Economic Advisor put out a few hours ago before I come to Mr. Mundle, in which he says, in a market economy, focus on economic growth requires adhering to some key principles, easing structural constraints, directing resources to best use, and reallocation of resources from hands that manage them poorly to better ones. Need to stay steadfast on them. Mr. Mundle, how do you read this? To my very simple understanding, the message seems to be that if some businesses or sectors are doing badly, maybe those resources are not very well managed, and let that kind of a market system take its own course. Those assets will then pass on to people who know how to better manage them. That's at least my very simplistic understanding. How do you read it? Yes, Mr. Mundle, that question is for you, sir.
Is that addressed to me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I must say, first of all, I want to correct you. I'm not from NIPFP. My present affiliation, I'm Distinguished Fellow at the National Council of Applied Economic Research. Right. But coming to the subject under discussion, I must say I found the statement of the Chief Economic Advisor and the tweet you just read out extremely disappointing. He seems to be completely lacking an understanding of the gravity of the economic situation both globally and domestically. And instead of conveying some confidence that the Chief Economic Advisor is on top of the situation and that he and the government know what sort of policies to pursue, he had nothing to say on what the government's thinking is. Instead, he just, using these childish analogies about father, child and all that, he went after the private sector. It's such a symptom of weakness of an argument that you don't have anything to say about where your stand is and what you're going to do. Everybody recognizes that there's a combination of serious structural distortions in the economy plus a cyclical problem, and there's a whole range of policy measures both of a reform kind and of a cyclical kind that need to be undertaken. They've been widely discussed. He had nothing to say about any of this. On the structural reform side, there are product market and factor market corrections to be done. We all know about that. But those things will take time before the benefits kick in. So in the interregnum, you certainly need to do a few things to generate demand, because all the drivers of the economy on the demand side, whether it is exports, whether it is investment, whether it is government spending, have all been sharply dipping last year and are expected to further dip this year, so that your exports, your growth is like to go down maybe to 6% or even less. And in this situation, you need the government spokespersons to come out with a very clear picture of what is its policy and action agenda. We got none of that in that statements that I heard, and I find that extremely disappointing.
Okay, I want to play out for our panel one more comment, and this time from Union Minister Nitin Gadkari, because we had the opportunity to speak to him as well. And now we're not claiming that these two comments is the entire government plan. It's just giving us some kind of a look into what thinking there is in the government right now. Here is Mr. Gadkari speaking specifically about the plight of the auto sector. Let's just listen in.
समय के अनुसार सेक्टर को भी रिसर्च करना, नए नए प्रोडक्ट को लाना. अब ये मॉडल नहीं लाते क्या, बदलते नहीं क्या हर साल? हाँ, हर साल नए उसी का नया मॉडल हर साल लाते. तो ये होने वाला है, ये नेचुरल कोर्स में होगा, पर हम किसी को बंद नहीं कर रहे हैं. डिमांड एंड सप्लाई के आधार पर वो अपने यूनिट को चलाए, हमें कुछ कहना नहीं.
लेकिन फिलहाल किसी तरह के स्टिमुलस का कोई विचार एटलीस्ट ऑटो सेक्टर के लिए नहीं है.
नहीं है भी, वो फाइनेंस मिनिस्टर करेगा, उनके अधीन वो विषय है.
Okay, so this is giving us another perspective and another thinking. I want to open up the debate. So if someone has a point to come in, please indicate. Meanwhile, I'll go to Mr. Sabnavis. Again, the sense, we're getting is that, yes, we understand there may be some hiccups, but we see this, and we being the government, we see this as short-term problems. Don't expect a huge helping hand. We will maybe provide an enabling environment. Is that, though, enough for the situation we are in right now?
I think it's enough, because I think what we say a short-term problem, which was there for last year, has already started moving into the first quarter. And we believe that this kind of a situation is going to carry on for the next 3 quarters too. So therefore, there is something which has to be done in order to spur demand. And I think this is where I think some kind of flexibility should be shown by the government in terms of their fiscal numbers, whether they're willing to go in for a higher fiscal deficit and bring in certain amount of demand. Because otherwise, if we see in a normal course of activity, we'll have to wait for private sector demand to pick up in a very, very gradual manner, because consumption today is down because rural income did not increase. We have not seen the organized sector witness any great increase in employment or in terms of incomes, which has actually affected the overall consuming power, that is discretionary spending power. So this is something which has to be reversed, and I think will happen only in the normal course of time. And it's going to be a very, very gradual process. But if you want something to happen fast, it will be more on the investment side, which has an initiative has to be taken by the central government. I don't think the state governments have a wherewithal right now. They have all kinds of problems with their fiscal deficit. It's only the central government which is in a position to spend. And if they take a bold decision to probably put another 0.5% of GDP in terms of capital expenditure, that could help. But looking at the way in which this government has performed so far, I think they're more keen on fiscal prudence. I really don't expect them to do anything big out there. There are going to be incremental steps taken in terms of reforms, which to my mind, we won't be able to turn things around. It's going to be a very slow growth process this year, and maybe even next year we could probably crawl beyond the 7% mark. But nothing great is what I'm really expecting. That is assuming that the monsoons are good and the private consumption cycle picks up in the normal course of activity.
Maybe that's the hope. Maybe that's the hope, Mr. Sinha, that, the festive season might move things along, at least on the consumption front, that, monsoons or good monsoons will change things on the rural front. Is that the hope, and is that the wait and watch attitude you sense?
Look, I think that, as I said earlier, the government really has one of two options that it needs to pursue. One is that they can respond to the current slowdown that is happening by virtue of certain kind of spending. Now, that spending can be in terms of tax reductions, it can be specific benefits to certain sectors, so that's one kind of course of action, some kind of a small fiscal stimulus. The second thing is that they can just say, okay, look, as long as we do the right things, as long as we carry on doing structural reform in different sectors, at some point the slowdown will begin to reverse itself, especially if the view is that this is a cyclical slowdown, and therefore there will be some reversion of this, as you said, with the festive season, if the monsoon is good and so on, and then things will begin to turn themselves around. And in that case, if the hue to fiscal prudence right now, that the upturn then will be much more sustained and much more long term. And the fact that they'll only really be in let's say year 2 of their 5-year term, may give them the feeling that, look, there will be another 3 years in which you can then have a more sustained sort of a growth.
Okay.
So they can certainly take that path as well. So I get the feeling that sometimes that the government is really thinking about doing things with a more long-term intent in mind, rather than just giving some short-term benefits just because certain sectors are complaining. And I think that is to some extent what is being reflected in the comments that you played out, that just because one particular sector is making such a big song and dance about things going down, they don't want to be seen to be caving into pressure on account of of a particular sector saying something like this.
Yeah.
But they might at the same time do a bit of a mix and match. They might give some kind of a broader fiscal stimulus just to revive demand,
Right.
and then also play for longer term structural reform that can then drive the economic growth in the more longer term. And I would be quite okay with that philosophy if that's what they choose to do. I think it would be prudent, it would be healthy in the long run, and it would give us a more sustainable scenario.
Yeah, but do we have the time? Do we have the time at the pace with which we are seeing things, quote unquote, unravel? Maithili, the song and dance sector, maybe auto because it's the most vocal, but real estate is in pain, FMCG is in pain. It's not just the guys over at the auto sector, is it?
Oh, absolutely not. In fact, the pain is spreading, which is why the government needs to look at both the short term, the medium term, as well as the long term. Yes, we need structural reform, but structural reform invariably entails short term pain for long term gain. And in the short term, there is definitely pain. So you need to have both. You need to have a balm right now, which essentially means some kind of fiscal loosening, because it's like ironic that in the interim budget in February, we had targeted 3.4% fiscal deficit. And then Nirmala Sitharaman's budget in July says 3.3. So at a time when you got clear indications that the economy was slowing, indications that we did not have in February, in fact, you tighten the screws even more. So I really fail to understand what is the government's thinking. So what you need to do is ease up a little bit on spending, and of the right kind of spending. Spend on investment, don't spend on consumption, because investment is the driver for growth.
Right.
Consumption can never be a driver for growth in an economy at our level of development. And investment in the time when the private sector is not investing has to come from government. So ease up, spend on the right things is my advice.
Okay, last word to you, Mr. Mundle, before I wrap up. What do you think should be the course for action from here on, and what do you sense will be the government's course from action from the little that we've seen so far in terms of statements?
Yeah, in a sense, I'm quite sympathetic to the view of Mr. Gadkari. I am never in support of all these special, measures being given to support special interests of the auto sector and so on. It's much more important to focus on creating an enabling environment to generate dynamic demand. And for that, again, we know there are lots of studies which show that, these little tax concessions here and there, they don't actually help. It's much more important to take action on the expenditure side. And I agree with Maithili that investment expenditure is better than consumption expenditure. But everything can't be spent on investment. So both investment and consumption spending by the government, because there was a huge cut last year. People don't realize this, but there was a huge expenditure compression last year, which is one of the major factors accounting for the slowdown in growth. And this year, because of the unrealistic tax projections, you will get another huge compression in expenditure to try and keep to that 3.4% fiscal deficit. So you're likely to see a further shock in growth unless they raise more revenue and then spend more so that they can revive demand. I mean, that really is the principal macroeconomic strategy they should pursue, in addition to soft interest rates, which the RBI is already doing. And this, of course, has to come along with fixing the problem of the non-bank finance companies, which is actually killing the small, medium industry sector. That's a very important thing. And raising spending power in the rural areas, again through expenditure. And that's not investment expenditure, that is all kinds of transfer payments. The government has some schemes, should pick them up more to give reduce distress in
Yes.
the farm sector and give more spending power to rural areas.
Okay.
I think that is the broad macroeconomic framework we should pursue.
Well, we'll wait and see what the framework really is and whether the private sector can hope for a helping hand at this tough time from the government. I want to thank all of you for joining us on the first debate. Very short break right here on India Development Debate. When we come back, we're talking about the Chidambaram case. The former finance minister will be in CBI custody till the 26th of August. But what are the legal merits and demerits? Two top lawyers on either side face off in a legal argument on the big INX scam. That coming right up. Don't miss it.